History Lab studio.
It's probably every historian's dream to find a forgotten collection of original sources. For a long time, historians of Chinese Australians had real problems finding Chinese language historical sources. So imagine how one of today's guests felt when she found a collection of 100-year-old Chinese language documents carefully stored in cabinets in a building in Melbourne's Chinatown. She's part of a new generation of historians using their facility with Chinese languages to write new histories of Chinese Australians, taking a closer look at the lives of women in the Chinese community and thinking about the role that friendships played for the Chinese men who rushed to Australia in search of gold. Welcome to Field Notes. I'm your host, Michelle Arrow. Today we bring you a conversation between two historians of Chinese Australia, Sophie Loy-Wilson from the University of Sydney and Macquarie University's Mei-fen. They talk about the importance of connecting with local communities when writing their histories and the ways that history brings family and national stories together. They also speak powerfully about the ways that emotions are embedded in their history making. Their work asks new questions about Chinese identities in our history. Not just, are you Chinese or are you Australian? But which Chinese are you?
So we're sitting here in UTS in the recording studio, and what this makes me think of, Mei-fen, is that kind of a stone's throw away down in Haymarket in Chinatown is this gorgeous KMT building, painted white with blue at the top. And I have a memory, 20-year-old memory of walking up to the attic of this building trepidatiously as like a young student and seeing all these newspapers kind of bound up in the attic of the KMT Chinatown. The KMT is the Kuomintang or the Kuomintang, which is the Chinese Republican Party. Is that correct, Mei-fen?
The official name is the Chinese National Party of Australasia, and it established in 1921. So the building was launched in 1921.
And I'm aware that you spent a lot of time going through these newspapers. I, at the time, didn't have good enough Chinese to read the complicated characters in these newspapers. And so I would look at them with this great desire to want to know what they said, right? Little did I know that as I was staring at these piles of mildewed paper, there was this historian who'd switched from Irish studies to Chinese Australian history to kind of rescue this newsprint. So I suppose I just wanted to know a little bit about that decision, how you came to these Chinese Australian newspapers.
Chinese newspaper is one of my research topics for my PhD thesis. And as Sophie just mentioned, when I begin this research, Chinese language source is pretty difficult to access. So newspaper is one of the main source I use for my PhD thesis. And during that period, I think Sophie's dream is, I try to say something. My PhD journey is pretty interesting because in the beginning it's quite challenging to find a Chinese language source, and then it comes to a very, very interesting journey to me because in the end I did discover a bank of material of the Chinese Council Journal of the Qing period to the Republic of China's period in the so-called KMT building in Melbourne. And that is really outstanding moment in my life. But that is also one of the reasons why we always believe the community history and academic history should need each other. Because the community history, they have the source, they have a story, but academic historian, they know how to, explain and how to connect our personal story to a bigger one. But also, I think that's also really important because in the very beginning, when I come to people's house or community group, I thought it's quite easy to just come with my research question and people will just open up, but it's not. It's pretty challenging. So through this journey is not just to open up the Chinese language source, but also rethink about how to be a historian in our field, but also in the community.
I would argue that not only do you represent how to be a historian in the field of Chinese Australian history, but I would argue you also represent how to be a good human being. So, Mei-fen, when you opened up the cabinets in Melbourne Chinatown to discover the remnants of the Chinese consulate. This is the Qing Dynasty consulate in Australia. We didn't think these records existed, but Mei-fen went back, I think, a number of times to a building in Chinatown in Melbourne. She didn't take no for an answer, and she politely asked if she could open some cabinets, I think, and out of those cabinets fell incredibly valuable documents that showed the Qing Dynasty had this fascinating consulate in Melbourne. Mei-fen, I wanted to ask you about not just doors that have been opened to you, such as the ones in Melbourne Chinatown, but also doors that have been closed. You hinted at that just then. One of the things that I know you did and that you inspired me, that deeply inspired me when you were doing your PhD, is you built lots of relationships with community members. In fact, close friendships with a woman called Marina Ma, for example. And I know that you've made hard choices in your career of what to include in your work, what to exclude. And I think that your ethical choices about inclusion and exclusion, how to tell stories with respect, has meant that you've maintained these lovely relationships within the community. So I wanted to ask about Marina Ma and how you met her and the story of that incredible friendship.
Okay, so Marina Ma is the daughter of the very well-known Chinese merchant Henry Fei in the New England tableland. And how I meet Marina Ma, so when I did my PhD, I was invited to give a speech at the Sydney KMT's building, and however, I spoke in Mandarin, in Chinese. And Marina Ma, who was born in Australia, she doesn't understand any Chinese. However, she recognized her father's name. So after my presentation, she come to me and just asked me why you talk about my father. So I begin to talk about the KMT's history, but she doesn't understand. And then we share quite a lot of friendship during our communication. I think that is kind of the privilege for me to understand her more and more, and but also the family and how she was the local born girls and then moved to Sydney and also engaged with the community, and also she had a big heart to share that kind of material, but also the experiences she come to, and also introduced me to all the family, all the the network she had. And I think Marina also respect kind of the spirit of the generation we before, so that is the community, they know each other, and they all willing to share their experience, their souls, their love, their food to each other. But however, I also want to mention they also have the struggle, they also have the tension, they also have a pain within the families, within the communities. Yeah,
I could feel that in your writing about Marina, because it seemed that there was so much said, but also some things unsaid, that you seem to just understand her deeply and respect her deeply. Could you speak a little bit about what it might have been like to be a woman in the Chinese Australian community in her period more generally? What do you think life was like for women like Marina? What were the things that they might have done, and what were the hardships they might have endured?
Marina was come from a merchant family, so you will see she was really privileged to have to be good educated and to have good networking, and then have that kind of literary life. Not every woman during the Cold War period can experience. And then she went to school, and then she was share during the summer, each family meet each other. They will have the picnic during the when they have a free time, and then she go out in the rural New South Wales, and she don't have many Chinese friends, and the family there, they always be respected by the community. And that is really, really interesting to me, because my research always focus on remote area, so-called Sydney area. And that is quite a lot of story about the community tension, about the political division, but also the gap between the leaders and the female community, female members. So Marina's story is kind of a reflection. Not every Chinese live at that time. They can we can assume they are, have the same experience. But she do touch that kind of story, just like other Australians, they enjoy their education, their life, their friendship, and with other family. But when she moved to Sydney, it's the other story. She had more opportunity to engage with the community activity, but also, to represent herself more like a Chinese woman. And then she'd be invited to join the Chinese Women Association. But that kind of the women's organization, I would say, is very, very different compared with other males organization I study. They're more caring and more about charity, more about care, to help each other. So that kind of story is pretty different.
Mei-fen, when I first read your work, I was struck by the intricate way you rebuilt these Chinese community organizations. So you understood kind of the political tensions, the rivalries. I'd studied this man, William Liu. And so I was fascinated by the ways that your research showed me these like political and personal rivalries between these guys, the ways in which politics from outside of the community, from overseas, from China, affected their relationships and their lives, and also local Australian politics. But increasingly in your work, I saw this thread about feminism. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. So when did you begin thinking about Chinese Australian women? When did this kind of aspect of your research emerge? Was there a moment or a discovery? I'd love to know more.
Okay. So one of the fun for me when I do the research is to search with someone we don't know.
Yeah.
And because I begin with the newspapers, and I find it's really fascinating because the newspaper is a lot of story and mention about someone's wife, someone's daughter, but they even mention about their name. And sometimes, but if you compare with the English newspapers, the woman's name will show up. So that gave me something I really try to understand how the woman to be present in a different community setting. And something come to Marina Ma definitely is one of the inspiring case for me to begin to think about the role of the woman in the community building. But also think about ourselves. We are also the woman, and we come from our background. And I grew up in Taiwan, and I always grew up with my grandmother. But I believe my grandmother, she will not never have a name in the history. So when I do my historical research, this kind of woman always attract my attention. And that is one of the reasons, back to several years ago, I began to write a paper on the charity. And I found we definitely need to draw the woman's story in that kind of research. But pretty challenging because we can't really find the archives in official archive for these women. So bit by bit, we need to mapping these women together. And it really shocked me that they did quite a lot of things in visual work, but it's super important to stick the community together, but also soften the political tension among the male leaders. How about you, Sophie?
It's so wonderful to hear your answer and to think about your grandmother, Mei-fen. For me, I began my work focusing on a man. My first project was on this man, William Liu, in my honours thesis, and I was very interested in his fight against white Australia. So I came from this position of wanting to understand Australian racism, and I was curious about his tactics for criticising white Australia. But something troubled me even back then, and this is a long time ago. I was aware that his mother, Florence, was white and his father was Chinese. The way that he wrote about his mother in some of his papers was sort of inconsistent. He'd write about visiting her, or he'd write that she died. It became clear to me, and others have researched this as well, that she was in fact placed in a mental asylum. And I once saw a photograph of her when she was much older, and there was something ghostly about the experience of looking at this photograph and realizing this was his mother. I knew nothing about her. I knew little things, that she'd been a church organist, and I think that's how his father met her, and they were married, I think, somewhere around Surrey Hills. And I also found a Trove article when Trove emerged into our lives that I think was related to her about some of her difficulties in the community, and I sensed pain behind the story. And I wondered why I had walked away from this side of his story. I see myself as a feminist, very close to my own grandmother, and who has been a big influence in my life. And I thought, why did I leave this side of the story? And I think it was also in his writing I sensed discomfort, and I didn't lean into it. I walked away from it. What I've seen in your own work is you tend to be fearless, and you can lean into the uncomfortable stories often and tell them with kindness and respect. So disputes between people or hardships in their lives, and the way you write about it doesn't define their lives, but it acknowledges that life is up and down, things are good and bad. So I suppose for me, Mei-fen, the next part of my career, I do want to lean into this side of Chinese Australian history. I want to understand the life of Chinese Australian women in all its complexity. I want to think about the archival challenge, and I want to understand how Chinese women's work underpinned male power and male political power. So that's why I found your relationship with Marina Ma so beautiful, but also I found the way that you've been writing about Chinese Australian women so inspiring. So I'd love to ask you a bit more about your recent work on Chinese Australian women, including Taiwanese women in Australia and their fashion. I think that was a recent article that you wrote.
Thank you, Sophie. I think that is a really interesting story because we are also historian. So when we write a history, it's not just to write someone's history. Sometimes it reflects on how we think, like in the beginning you say, as a human being, how we understand the people's struggle, people's challenge, people's love, people's happiness. And for me, I find history can't answer this question. But history did show us quite a lot of strategy or choice or, how the people make a decision. And all of this is come to show us what does the human being means. And as a migration country in Australia, we all very privileged to have, very different migration, bring their experience to here. And my recent research is continue because I begin to research on the identity politics of Chinese migration during the Huacha policy area. And then because the KMT project, I really found her to meet quite a lot of family, including Marina Ma. So people open the door, but people also begin to find, my family history is not just our private history. It's all connect to organization, connect to the national history, connect to the transnational history. But more and more they share to me is more confusing stories. They don't understand. I don't understand either. And then it comes to maybe to rethink, how the world changed the way we think about history, in a post-war period. And that is one of the reasons I begin to do the research on the post-war period. And that's also one of the reasons when I conduct my National Libraries Fellowship back several years ago, quite a lot of material pump up. It's not just about mainland China. It's also about the other China, which is Taiwan, and Taiwan is my homeland. And that is really, really interesting. And it comes to, the story we shared before is why the migration, why the Chinese Australia here would be so struggle is they always be asked one of the question, do you belong here? And in a post-war Australia, they come to the other question, which China you belong to? So this is pretty important question, in a post-war period, Chinese will be, whatever you local born or however you migrate from mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Malaysia, Singapore, you'll be asked this question. So my answer is come to women again. And I find a woman, again, I don't think they do it on purpose, but I find the other way because I try to find where we can find a woman. Again, they are not appear in the official archives. However, we have a magazine, we have a newspaper in the post-war Australia period. And then I find out that is the magazine and showcase the Chinese woman's dress. But the dress, when I say the dress, is not just, how they present there as the Chinese woman. In fact, they mixed with very, very different material, and also the very design. And one case I talk about is the woman come from Taiwan in the 1960s, and of course she represent Free China, and of course she had a political purpose to showcase, what does the woman come from a free and democratic, not really democratic society, but come from the so-called non-communist society look like, and she dressed up like the qipao, the traditional Chinese dress. But she also used this to portray, a cultural bridge to the woman in Australia in a local level. And in the 1960s, it's quite interesting because the Australian society begin to look outside and begin to look at Asia, and they want to understand more about Asia. So you will see they also create this kind of the British Queen's title, the Queen of Pacific. And the person from Taiwan dressed up like the Chinese woman win this title. And you can see the culture in the 1960s is pretty confused, but also really interesting.
I love this so much because it speaks to both the stereotypes Australians have about East Asia. So the way women dress, it's a classic stereotype, of course, the famous image of the qipao. But it also speaks to the way that dress is a message that falls on multiple ears. So when she wore the dress in that way, she was speaking to many communities. So white Australians might have heard one message, but other members of the community in the Chinese community might have heard a different message. And so I think this is the wonder of history, when we can finally see the multiplicities of eyes and ears that see a certain image or read a certain document and try to understand how that document functioned or that moment functioned in the past. It's really exciting. So, Mei-fen, I love the way you framed that. In a kind of pre-war period, so before the Second World War, there's this classic question for so much of Australian and colonial history, who is Chinese or who is Australian? What does it mean to be Chinese? What does it mean to be Australian? And I think you're saying after World War II, there's this other question that still pervades many people's lives in a powerful way, which is which Chinese are you? And this remains a difficult, painful question to this day. I wanted to talk a little bit about your experience researching the Cold War period, a very challenging period, very popular period now for historians, the Cold War, the global 60s. And I know, as usual, you sat at many living room tables. You talked to many families. I've talked to families a little bit about this period, the post-World War II period in Australia, and many had difficult stories to tell about both immigration issues, but also about how they felt about being Chinese. So obviously, just in ways that you feel comfortable, I'd love to know a little bit about that experience of talking to families about the post-war period, what you learned, what it was like.
This is a difficult question because, yes, I did talk to quite a lot of people, and more I find this is really challenging question because I always be very careful to represent any family members or the community to talk about how or what do they represent to be Chinese in Australia. Also, I think it's also because my personal experience. The reason I come to study history is that kind of the question, what do you mean to be Chinese? So I grew up in Taiwan, and so for many audience, probably you guys, I believe you guys know where is Taiwan. But if you don't know where is Taiwan, maybe you will know the superstar Jay Chou. So Jay Chou just wrote a very popular song, Gold Rush Town, and Sophie just write a brilliant the piece about his song to connect with the early Chinese Australian history. I grew up with the same generation like Jay Chou. So that is the end of the martial law in Taiwan. And we begin to can have the freedom, to study abroad, to travel freely outside Taiwan. But it also pumped up the question, who am I? And are we Chinese? Are we Taiwanese? Are we something else? So that is something, so I always remember in one of the classroom in my high school, one history teacher come in and begin to talk about the political hero of the Taiwan. In my life, that is for the very first time I hear about that kind of terrible history. I can't believe it, because before that, the school always teach us about Chinese history. So Chinese for me before that was really, really boring, because we just need to memorize something we don't quite understand, something we are not very familiar with. But after that day, that moment still in my mind for a very long time. And I begin to question about who am I? And also that is something I discovered. History can be very, very powerful tool for personal identity, but also for us to explore the worldview. And that is one of the moment in my life. That's how I turned to become a historian. But I didn't just jump in to study the Chinese migrant history in Australia. I choose to study Ireland. So cultural nationalism is one of my topic for my master. But my question, I try to answer not just about Ireland, but also about being Chinese, and also the division between China and Taiwan. So just like the political division between Ireland and England. And also ask about, can we say no to be Chinese-ness? And that is kind of the question drive me to this history research. So even today, I still find is not easy answer, to answer your question, Sophie, how to be a Chinese, and can we say no to Chinese-ness? And also, so for example, the family I interview, quite a lot, they already began to identify themselves as Australian. But in our historical research, we still need to label them. We still need to categorize them. They belong to the Chinese migration. Sometimes it's pretty challenging, and sometimes it's not just about academic choice. It's also about emotional choice. And I know, Sophie, you have the special issues several years ago. Talking about this emotion become very driving force. Help us to rethink the Chinese Australia history. What would you respond to this question? How do you, if you say, from the outsider to think about the Chinese identity or the Chinese-ness in Australia's national history, what do you think? What do you think we can learn from this research about Chinese identity to rethink about being Australia today?
Yeah, I don't know why I find this so emotional. I think it's because hearing your story about sitting in school, learning a history that felt so distant to you, that felt so disconnected to you, and then having a moment when you were able to access a history that was real for you, that was a tool for you for self-expression and self-actualization, I find really moving. And I identify with that definitely. So it's so fascinating, Mei-fen, to think about your history in Ireland as well, your interest in Irish history, because that's also a place that's been colonized, layers of complexity, and had its language taken away. For me, it's incredible to reflect when I hear your question. I think back to when I was a kid in Beijing. My dad worked in the embassy in Beijing when I was 11. My dad was a Russian scholar. He didn't really speak Chinese, and I hadn't learnt Chinese before I arrived in Beijing in 95. We were both fished out of water. And my father thought, I speak Russian. It's easy to learn Chinese. And he really struggled with the language. I remember him writing the characters down again and again and again. He was trying to learn complicated characters. And for the listeners that don't know, in Taiwan and Hong Kong, we study complicated characters or fantizi, and in mainland China, Mao changed the alphabet, the language, to be simplified, to simplified characters. So it's a difference in the way that the writing works in those places, which reflects the history. So my father was studying the complicated characters. He would sit there trying so hard, and he kind of failed to learn it. He was a bit old and he was a bit stressed by his job at the embassy. And I remember one day I was with my dad in Chang'an Avenue, which is, Long Peace Road in Beijing. It's where Tiananmen Square is. And he pointed to everyone around me and he said, Sophie, everyone under 40 went through the Cultural Revolution. And he's like, do you know what that means? And I didn't really know what that meant, but I began studying it. And I remember the whole place opening up to me because I thought, what a thing to survive. What a difficult time to survive. And I looked at all the people around me and they seemed like heroes to have survived it. So that was the first time that history built connection for me. I didn't speak great Chinese. I was just an 11-year-old, but I began to understand that history was a way to connection, to belonging, to understanding and compassion, to not feeling different and lonely. So it was a bridge for loneliness for me and understanding. And it was the beginning of me trying to grapple with the great promise and tragedy that is mainland China. And I continue to try to kind of grapple with that. So I'm quite moved by your question because I remember that sense of suddenly having a way forward at a difficult time in my life through history. Mei-fen, I'd love to know what you're doing now. I know you've got a book coming out, I think, and I'm really excited about it. So can you tell us about the book that's going to come out soon?
Yes. Okay. So this book is about one of the particularly Taiwan-born Australian intellectual. I search on his political life, but use his political life to understand the migration, particularly Taiwanese migration strategy to negotiation about the democracy in Australia, so-called multicultural period in the 1970s, but also how he struggled against, being Chinese, Taiwanese, Australian, but also how he's used the writing power to help the Taiwan through the democratization period, but also influence the China's democratization movement in the 1980s. But some strategy he was successful, some strategy he failed. I think that is quite normal. It's just like a personal choice, but is really interesting. And he grew out in Taiwan in the 1960s, and I'm very fortunate to have the family to donate all of his personal writings, so you can see how this kind of the young person, grew out in Taiwan in a global 1960 and educate in the United States and then move to Australia just before the Huacha policy put to the end, and then turn to the academic literature in the University of Queensland, but also engage with the local community and become a very important influential for the community, to support the Taiwan and China's democracy. How about you, Sophie? What is your project? What is your next project?
So it's so great to hear you talk, Mei-fen. What happened to me was that I spent a lot of time in the 20th century and I wanted to understand the gold rushes. It was something that I wasn't taught growing up because I grew up overseas. When I first came back to Australia from overseas when I was 18, I'd missed out on that. And I went to various Chinatowns and I'd hear about these gold rushes. And I know it's going to sound hilarious to Australian listeners, but I didn't know really what they were. And what I've done in my archival research is I've made myself really sit in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, 1880s and kind of try to understand the madness of this moment. And I wanted to do it because I wanted to find Chinese archives and voices. I wanted to understand this generation that came. And it's been crazy because what I've realized is just the mad scramble of their lives was deeply anarchic and chaotic. But the archives have also been really emotional. A lot of the archives are about the friendships that we have to form to survive. That's a universal. They're about the Australian environment. They're about seeing koalas for the first time and maybe believing you could use them for aphrodisiacs, or it's about using goannas, meeting Indigenous people. So they're deeply Australian archives about the environment, the Indigenous lands these guys found, but they're from the perspective of these Chinese men. So I've had to kind of build a bridge to their hearts and souls and try to understand their lives. And the connection for me has been the Australian landscape. and how they survived in it, but also their friendships, the friendships that failed to survive in Australia, the ones from the village, and the new friendships that they built to survive. And that's been really fascinating. So I'm writing a book about these guys at the moment, and I'm hoping it connects with people. What I've had to kind of understand is the role of place. So I've had to really embed them in, say, Bendigo. So I've discovered this wonderful historian called Frank Clune, who wrote a famous history called Bendigo. And in fact, it's sort of a dated book, like it's got this 1970s cover, but it's the richest history. And he just calls it Bendigo, but in it, there is so much information about Chinese lives in a kind of deeply multicultural, intricate way. Chinese miners watching theatre, for example, and yelling at operas. And it just captures the kind of craziness of the time. And so I've had a really, in-depth relationship with Frank Clune's Bendigo and also Western Bates Ballarat. So that's been kind of amazing for me. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. So I suppose I'd love to ask you, Mei-fen, for a recommendation. So a historian that you love or a book you'd recommend for the listeners to read as a starting point for the history that we both love.
The book I would like to recommend is Professor John Fisher, Bi Huai Lai. So that definitely is the super important book. And Professor John Fisher also is the mentor of my PhD thesis. But this is not the reason I recommend his book. I think his book is really significant, for the very first time to remind the people the Huaozhou policy is not just a policy. It also mentioned this kind of the Chinese Australian, this catalog is kind of a narrative. It's about the power, who have the kind of power to define who belong to Australia or not. And then he also discovered quite a lot of very significant story about the Chinese communities here, particularly in Australia, how they try to be modern, try to struggle to survival, but also try to belong. And I think this is also very important. John also bring this kind of story. This is not a local story. This definitely, and it's not just Australia's story. It's really transnational history. So that I would recommend for John Fisher's Bi Huai Lai.
I love that. It's a Bible for us, I think. I return to that book all the time. John Fitzgerald's Big White Lie. One of the books that I also return to all the time is Kathy May's Topsawyers, which I came to quite late. It's a classic of Chinese Australian history. Kathy May was a student at James Cook University in this incredible moment when Henry Reynolds was there, and there were these famous courses in Australian history being taught in Queensland at James Cook University. And Kathy May wrote this book, Topsawyers, and I reread it recently, Mei-fen. It's about the Chinese in Cairns. And she has all these references to quote-unquote Chinese informers. And I realised that she sat down in the 70s and chatted to all these Chinese old-timers. Unfortunately, her wonderful appendix doesn't have, notes about that. There are names of people that helped her. But it speaks to that wonderful kind of, aspect of Australian history, which is really embedding a story in place, in something, in a place that you love and know, which is something you do beautifully, Mei-fen. And Kathy May just honours Cairns incredibly in this book. For example, she talks about Chinese rituals of death, how many of the Chinese locals were quite scared of drowning and what happened to bodies after drowning or bodies after they were eaten by crocodiles, for example. And she talks about a particular boating festival that was developed after a bunch of Chinese people died in an accident, a river accident on a boat. And after that accident, there was a yearly memorial for those deaths where a special boat was let loose on the Barron River to honour the deaths of these people, but also to appease their ghosts. And I love the ways in which these stories reflect European relationships with the land, these complex relationships that Europeans developed with the Australian landscape, this Indigenous land that they were on, this stolen land. And similarly, Chinese migrants did the same. And Kathy May's incredible kind of rich book, Topsawyers, I think captures that cross-cultural complexity and also the relationship to death and loss and home and homesickness and longing that could be symbolised by boats. So I'd highly recommend Topsawyers as well.
Thanks to Sophie and Mei-fen for being our guests today. If you'd like to read more of their work, Sophie's next book will be called Chinese Ghosts, Seeking Justice in Gold Rush Australia. And Mei-fen's forthcoming book is called Cui Liang Chu's Unfinished Homeland, which will be published in 2027. Field Notes is brought to you by the Australian Historical Association. You can learn more about us by visiting our website, theaha.org.au. History Lab is an Impact Studios podcast made on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Field Notes was recorded and edited by Lachlan Accord.